Something we've talked about on this channel in the past is the possibility of Sony deciding next generation with the release of the PlayStation 5 to actually release more than one console at launch. Now, this sounds pretty far-fetched to most people, which is totally understandable because as far as we can look back, Sony hasn't really done that. I mean, the furthest they went is with the PlayStation 3 offering, different sizes and memory, but I think that's about it. But when we talk about two different consoles being launched, we're talking about two completely different consoles. And while it does sound like this is something that Sony wouldn't do, there's actually some evidence today that points to the possibility of this actually happening. Now, one thing I do want to reference when talking about this as well is that the reason why we mentioned this in the past is because it turns out that if this were to be a thing, Sony is not the only one considering it. We know for a while Microsoft, there was a lot of rumors regarding Project Scarlett, and how there was essentially two different consoles in the works. There was like a low-end model called Lockhart, and then a high-end model called Anaconda, and then it just apparently got scrapped internally, the Lockhart console that is, and they decided to just keep Project Scarlett as a single console, the more powerful version. And as far as we know, as of right now, Microsoft doesn't have any plans to do a second console, but they still might. We don't know. I'm only talking about this in the beginning here because we have to understand that this is something that both companies are considering. It's not just Sony. However, if we look at this report, or this patent, I should say, that was filed recently by Sony, the second console, or the lower-end console, might be a little bit different than what people were expecting. It says here, as reported in a post by Segment Next, Sony in August filed a very interesting patent. The patent filed by Sony was for a cloud gaming system, and it was filed on August 29th at the United States Patent Office. The patent said systems and methods are provided for cloud gaming. One system includes a plurality, I guess I'm saying that right, of computing resources in one or more data centers. The plurality of computing resources is configured to execute instances of games for client devices that are remote from the one or more data centers. Each instance for an executable game is associated with a processor or graphics processing unit, GPU, and memory. Memory is used for storing video frames generated for the executable game. The video frames are compressed for video game streaming to one or more client devices. The executable game is associated with video, audio, and input channels for said one or more client devices to control interactivity of operation of the executable game during said video game streaming. The cloud gaming system implements at least one channel driver to facilitate, if I could speak, processing for the one or more client devices when executed by the computing resources of the one or more data centers. Goes on to say it's important to bear in mind that big tech firms like Sony often file patents, so it remains to be seen if this is simply an idea they're looking into, or if the patent is for a PlayStation streaming box that Sony could launch. And it also goes on to say that the news comes after rumors emerged that Sony were reworking the PlayStation Now streaming service. It was claimed this revamped PS Now service would be getting a big push alongside the PS5. So this is some very interesting stuff here, and I know that was a lot of really technical stuff we just read, and frankly, I don't even fully understand it, but it's pointing out here that clearly whatever this patent is, it is for a type of streaming box that Sony would be interested in maybe selling alongside the PlayStation 5, or maybe not too long after the launch of the PlayStation 5 with their PlayStation Now service. Now, I know that there's a lot of people who are going to immediately jump to the conclusion that there's no way Sony would do this because we don't want them to do it, right? I'm not a big fan of the idea of cloud gaming. I've expressed my disdain for it simply because I just don't want that to basically ever be a threat to the way we game now, the traditional way of console gaming or even gaming on PC, or just having that tangible physical experience. And while it seems unrealistic as of right now for cloud gaming to ever seem like a threat, that doesn't mean it won't be. And I think it still has a long way to go. But I'm not, ignorant to the fact that this is something that all gaming companies, including Sony, are going to be pursuing. And Sony, recently struck a partnership with Microsoft to utilize their cloud data centers, and it seems like this is something they're really going to be putting a lot of emphasis and resource into, whether we like it or not. And it may not be an entirely bad thing. I know I've been hard on Microsoft for this, with what they're doing with Project X Cloud, but I think it's becoming a little bit more apparent, if I'm being honest, that this is just going to be a side thing as of right now. It's clear that the consoles are going to be at the forefront, especially with Sony, and honestly, Microsoft has went on record saying this as well, but we know just how heavily Sony relies on their hardware sales. So we know that cloud gaming is not going to be something that really is a threat to the physical, tangible gaming experience that most of us here on this channel love and support. So I'm not necessarily worried about that. And, Google Stadia, regardless of how we feel about it, both Microsoft and Sony are paying close attention to it, because even though it seems like it's going to flop, it's still Google and it's still competition. And we know that other companies also are, slowly starting to get involved. So Sony and Microsoft just want to ensure that they're at the forefront of this, because it could end up being very profitable. And if it does end up blowing up one day, which it may or may not, we really don't know, neither do these companies, they just want to make sure that they have all of their bases covered. I've talked about this before, but getting back to the idea of a smaller, just cloud gaming console, I think it would be really interesting to see Sony do something like this, because PlayStation Now, it's funny to think that Sony was the first one actually to kind of really embrace cloud gaming, at least from the the big gaming companies. And I think that people often forget that, and people bring that up when I kind of talk about how I just don't like the amount of emphasis that Microsoft at times seems to put on cloud streaming. And to be honest, I think Microsoft has done a pretty alright job at trying to let people know, listen, it's not going to replace console gaming anytime soon. But still, it's just like, I don't know, seeing how much of a struggle they're having selling hardware, we know Sony's not having that same type of struggle. So, you just kind of see the difference between the two because of that, where Sony pretty much needs to sell hardware. Like, they really need to make sure that the PS5 sells extremely well. They can't really just sit back and say, oh, we're not worried because we can just reach, 2 billion gamers potentially with PlayStation Now. And while that may be true, Sony, I think, is smart enough to not bank on that. And we know this, right? Sony's going to be putting most of their emphasis on PlayStation 5, but I cannot fault them, and I can't say I would be surprised if during the PlayStation 5's reveal, there is a pretty heavy emphasis on PlayStation Now. PlayStation Now is something that they've kind of struggled with, even though it has made them money, and believe it or not, it's been doing all right, for them since it launched. But a lot of people who've used it, and I can't speak for myself because I haven't used it, a lot of people have said that it just isn't really there, and it needs some major improvements in some ways. And it's just not really, feasible to use that as your main way to consume games. Even for people who aren't willing to spend money on a console, the tech just isn't there. And now that we know that Sony has that deal with Microsoft where they get to use their cloud data centers, maybe now, PlayStation Now can end up being something much bigger for Sony. And it just wouldn't surprise me if they decided to do something like this. If we get the PlayStation 5, it's going to be a monster console, and the price is going to reflect that, obviously. But, it's going to be for the hardcore, and Sony has went on record saying that, that's really what their focus is going to be going into the PlayStation 5, on the hardcore gamer, and that's what matters to me most. I do not care if they want to pursue their ambitions with cloud gaming and PlayStation Now and even like a smaller micro cloud streaming console. I don't care. That's fine. And the same goes for Microsoft. But all I really care about is what you're going to be doing for the hardcore gamer, and just kind of showing us that the hardcore gamer takes the front seat, not the back seat. Cloud gaming, as of right now, should take the back seat. I can't blame them for working on this, and I'm not going to sit here and go on some rant and be like, I hate cloud gaming, and shake my old man cane at the sky, and screaming at the clouds. I'm not going to do that because, I've come to understand that this is just a path that all of these companies are going down, and it's just what's going to happen. Whether it ends up being a big success, we don't know. It may be a huge flop. It may be 10 to 15 years before cloud gaming is actually at the forefront of how people are consuming their games. We just don't know. All I do know is that people are very excited for the PlayStation 5, and if anybody has any concern about this, thinking that, Sony's going to start putting more focus on cloud gaming, and, they're going to reveal a cloud, streaming box next to the PS5, even if they did do that, the important part to understand is that their emphasis truly is going to be on the PlayStation 5. Their emphasis is going to be on delivering that hardcore gaming experience, because they're not going to abandon that audience. That audience is still here. It has made PlayStation what it is today. That audience has been retained throughout every generation, and that's not going to change next generation with the PlayStation 5, whether or not this console ends up becoming a reality. And, as it says here, we do have to understand that this may not be a thing in the end, because these companies file patents all the time, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But we do have to understand that Sony is in the process of reworking PlayStation Now, and they have went on record, as well as, not only saying that they are going to continue to support the hardcore gamer, but that they do plan to embrace PlayStation Now in a bigger way going into next generation. So overall, I think it's interesting, and I think it'll be a really interesting thing if, when we see the reveal of the PlayStation 5, we see a smaller micro cloud streaming console revealed alongside of it. It's not something that would excite me. It's not something I would probably even care about. But it just would be interesting to see the reaction of people who maybe are interested in it, and to see if it would be embraced or if it's something that would kind of be shunned. We really don't know. But interesting stuff to talk about and speculate about nonetheless. At this point, I'm going to ask you to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you think it's likely that Sony will end up creating a console like this that utilizes PlayStation Now? And if they do you think they're going to save it for the reveal, to reveal it alongside the PlayStation 5 as a second option for those who are not considered the hardcore gamer? Or do you think that Sony's going to be smart about it and just keep the PlayStation 5 reveal all about the hardcore gamer, and then maybe later on talk more about this micro console they're going to offer, or this cloud console, as well as PlayStation Now? Very interested to hear what you guys have to say. Be sure to leave the video a like if you enjoyed it or found it helpful at all. Really lets me know you guys enjoy the content. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. Hit the bell notification icon as well, and feel free to share this video out on top of all that. But until next time, guys, take care.